For 20 years, Heinrich Mueller ran the most trusted butcher shop in Willowbrook. His pork was legendary, tender, flavorful, with a taste that kept customers coming back for more. Families gathered around dinner tables, savoring his specialty cuts. Children grew up on his meat, and neighbors recommended his shop to friends visiting from out of town. Mueller was more than a businessman. He was a pillar of the community, known for his generous donations to local charities and his warm smile behind the counter. But in the spring of 2003, a routine inspection would uncover a horror that defied comprehension. Hidden beneath his shop lay a secret that had been feeding the town for 2 decades. What the community had been consuming wasn't pork at all. It was human flesh, carefully prepared and sold to unsuspecting customers who trusted Mueller with their family meals. How could an entire town eat human flesh for 20 years without knowing? Before we dive into this disturbing tale, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story captivates you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly shocking for you. The brass bell above the door chimed cheerfully as Margaret Thompson pushed into Mueller's butcher shop, the familiar aroma of fresh herbs and cured meats welcoming her like an old friend. It was Tuesday morning in October 1983, and Heinrich Mueller was arranging thick cuts of pork chops behind the spotless glass counter with the precision of a surgeon. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." Heinrich called out, his German accent still thick after 5 years in America. His leather apron, pristine despite the early hour, bore only the faintest traces of his morning's work. "The usual for you today?" Margaret nodded, watching as Heinrich selected the perfect cuts with practiced hands. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he worked, each movement deliberate and respectful. Other butchers hacked at meat with casual efficiency, but Heinrich treated each piece as if it were precious. "You know, Heinrich, I've been buying meat for 40 years, and I've never tasted pork quite like yours," Margaret said, leaning against the counter. "What's your secret?" Heinrich's smile was modest, almost bashful. "In the old country, my grandfather taught me that meat must be treated with reverence. The animal gave its life, so we must honor that sacrifice with proper care." He wrapped her selections in crisp white paper, his movements methodical. "I age everything myself, use special herbs from my garden. Time and patience, Mrs. Thompson. These are the only secrets." The bell chimed again as Pastor Williams entered, removing his hat with the same respect he showed when entering his church. Heinrich's face lit up with genuine warmth. "Pastor, right on time. I have your Sunday roast ready." "You're too good to me, Heinrich," Pastor Williams said, accepting the carefully wrapped package. "The congregation still talks about that pork you donated for the church picnic. Never seen folks go back for seconds and thirds like that." Heinrich ducked his head with apparent embarrassment. "I am blessed to serve this community. It is my honor to give back." Margaret watched this exchange with growing fondness. When Heinrich had first opened his shop, she'd been skeptical. Another European immigrant, trying to make it in small-town America. She'd seen plenty come and go over the years. But Heinrich was different. He remembered everyone's preferences, asked about their families, and never tried to upsell inferior cuts. The shop itself reflected Heinrich's meticulous nature. The floors were swept clean, the display cases gleamed without a fingerprint, and not a single tool was out of place. Behind the counter, knives hung in perfect order, each one sharp enough to perform surgery. The back room, visible through an open doorway, showed the same obsessive organization. "How are you settling into Willowbrook?" Pastor Williams asked. "Finding everything you need. Everyone has been so welcoming," Heinrich replied, and Margaret heard genuine gratitude in his voice. "This is what I dreamed of when I left Germany. A place where neighbors know each other, where a man can build something with his own hands." Heinrich had arrived in Willowbrook in 1978, a quiet widower who spoke little about his past. He'd worked for old Miss Peterson at the previous butcher shop for 5 years, learning American ways and saving every penny until he could buy the business when Peterson retired. The transition had been seamless. Heinrich's superior skills quickly won over even the most skeptical customers. Any family back in Germany? Margaret asked. She'd been curious about Heinrich's past, but had never not to pry. Heinrich's expression grew distant. No family. The war took everyone. I came to America to start fresh, to build something new. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt a surge of sympathy. So many immigrants carried similar burdens, losses that could never be fully explained to those who hadn't lived through such times. "Well, you've certainly found your place here," she said gently. "This town is lucky to have you." As Margaret left the shop, Heinrich's perfectly wrapped packages in hand, she reflected on how fortunate Willowbrook was to have such a dedicated craftsman. The pork from Heinrich's shop had become the centerpiece of her family dinners. Her husband praised it constantly, and even her picky teenage son cleaned his plate when she served Heinrich's cuts. Behind the counter, Heinrich continued his morning routine, arranging the display with mathematical precision. Each piece of meat was positioned to catch the light, just so, making everything look as appetizing as possible. He took pride in his presentation, in the trust his customers placed in him. The basement door, barely visible behind stacks of supplies, remained locked as always. Heinrich was the only one with the key, and he guarded it jealously. After all, a craftsman needed his private workspace where he could perfect his art without interruption. The morning sun slanted through the shop windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. Everything was perfect, orderly, exactly as it should be. Heinrich Mueller had built exactly the life he'd dreamed of, respected, trusted, essential to his community's daily sustenance. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that Heinrich never seemed to receive delivery trucks like other butcher shops. They might have wondered where he sourced his superior meat. But in a small town, where trust ran deep and questions seemed impolite, such observations went unspoken. Heinrich hummed quietly as he worked, a German folk song from his childhood. Life was good in Willowbrook. His customers were satisfied, his reputation was solid, and his secret remained perfectly buried beneath their feet. Sarah Chen had been conducting health inspections for the county for 12 years, and she prided herself on her thoroughness. On this crisp April morning in 2003, she pulled her sedan into the parking space outside Mueller's butcher shop, clipboard in hand, and expectations set for another routine examination. The shop looked immaculate from the outside, as it always did. Heinrich Mueller maintained his storefront with the same obsessive care he'd shown for the past 20 years. The windows sparkled, the sidewalk was swept clean, and the vintage butcher shop sign swayed gently in the morning breeze. The familiar chime announced her entry, and Heinrich looked up from behind the counter with his characteristic smile. But Sarah, trained to notice details, caught something in his expression, a flicker of tension that quickly disappeared behind practiced charm. "Miss Chess, what a pleasant surprise. Your usual inspection. Just routine, Mr. Mueller. Nothing to worry about if everything's in order." Heinrich nodded enthusiastically, but Sarah noticed his hands fidgeting with the cleaning cloth he'd been using on the counter. In 12 years of inspections, she'd learned to read the subtle signs of nervousness. Most business owners showed some anxiety during inspections, but Heinrich's reaction seemed different somehow. She began her standard routine, checking temperatures in the display cases, examining the cleanliness of surfaces, and reviewing his documentation. Everything appeared perfect, too perfect perhaps. The meat display was arranged with museum-quality precision, each cut positioned at exact angles. The equipment gleamed without a single fingerprint or stain. "Your records, please," Sarah requested, and Heinrich quickly produced a leather-bound ledger. His handwriting was meticulous, each entry recorded with Germanic precision. But as Sarah reviewed the supplier invoices, something nagged at her. "I notice you don't have many delivery records here. Where do you source most of your meat?" Heinrich's pause was barely perceptible, but Sarah caught it. "I work with several small farms in the region, family operations. You understand. They prefer to deal in cash. Keep things simple." Sarah nodded, making a note. It wasn't unusual for rural suppliers to operate that way. but the volume of meat Heinrich moved through his shop seemed inconsistent with the sparse delivery documentation. "Could I see your storage areas?" Of course, of course." Heinrich led her to the walk-in cooler, his movements slightly stiff. The refrigeration unit was spotless, stocked with neatly arranged cuts that looked fresh and properly aged. But again, something felt off about the quantity relative to his sales volume. They moved to the back preparation area, where Heinrich's knives hung in perfect order and his cutting boards showed no signs of wear, despite decades of use. Everything was clean, organized, professional, yet Sarah's instincts whispered that something wasn't quite right. "What about your basement storage?" she asked, consulting her floor plan. "I don't see it documented here." Heinrich's face went completely still. "Basement? Oh, that's just personal storage. Nothing related to the business. Old furniture, family items from Germany." Sarah looked toward the back of the shop and spotted a heavy wooden door she'd never noticed before, partially concealed behind stacks of supplies. "I'm afraid I need to inspect all areas connected to the business premises. It's standard protocol. The stairs are very steep, dangerous, really. And there's nothing down there that relates to food preparation." Heinrich moved to block her view of the door, his voice taking on a pleading quality she'd never heard before. Red flags began waving in Sarah's mind. In 12 years of inspections, she'd encountered business owners trying to hide health violations, unpaid taxes, or unlicensed equipment. But Henrich's desperation seemed to go deeper than typical regulatory concerns. "Mr. Miller, I understand your concerns, but I do need to complete a full inspection. It won't take long." Henrich's composure was cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his hands trembled slightly as he wrung the cleaning cloth. "Please, Miss Chen, there's really nothing of interest down there. Perhaps we could schedule another time. I could prepare the area properly." The request was so unusual, so obviously evasive, that Sarah knew she'd stumbled onto something significant. Whether it was a health violation, tax evasion, or something else entirely, Heinrich Miller was clearly hiding something behind that basement door. "I'm going to need to see that basement today. Mr. Miller, if there's truly nothing business-related down there, then you have nothing to worry about." Heinrich stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of panic, calculation, and finally resignation. His shoulders sagged as if the weight of 20 years had suddenly settled on them. "The key is in my office," he said quietly, his German accent thicker than she'd ever heard it. "Please, when you see what's down there, remember that I am not a monster. I am a businessman who served this community faithfully." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine at the strange farewell quality in his words. Whatever lay behind that basement door had just transformed a routine inspection into something far more serious. She reached for her radio to call for backup, suddenly certain that she was about to discover something that would change Willowbrook forever. Heinrich walked to his small office with the slow, measured steps of a man approaching his own execution. The 20-year secret he'd guarded so carefully was about to be exposed, and with it, the comfortable life he'd built in this trusting community would crumble into dust. The brass key felt heavy in his palm as he returned to where Sarah waited, her radio crackling with the dispatcher's voice. Soon, very soon, the whole world would know what Heinrich Mueller had been feeding the good people of Willowbrook for 2 decades. Detective Mike Harrison arrived at Mueller's butcher shop within 15 minutes of Sarah Chen's radio call, followed closely by 2 patrol officers and an evidence technician. Sarah met them at the door, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly as she briefed them on Mueller's erratic behavior. "He's been cooperative since I called for backup," she explained, her voice tight with anxiety. "But Detective, whatever's down in that basement has him terrified. I've never seen a business owner react like this to a routine inspection." Heinrich sat quietly in his office chair, the brass key resting on the desk before him like a confession. His 20 years of careful composure had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour. When Detective Harrison approached, Heinrich looked up with something resembling relief. "Mr. Mueller, we need to inspect your basement. Will you cooperate with us?" Heinrich nodded slowly. "The key is there on the desk. I want you to know that I never intended for it to happen this way. I was always careful, always respectful." The cryptic statement sent another chill through the assembled officers. Detective Harrison had seen enough criminal investigations to recognize the tone of a man preparing to confess to something terrible. The basement door was solid oak, reinforced with metal brackets that seemed excessive for simple storage. Heinrich had installed 3 separate locks over the years, each one adding another layer of security to whatever lay below. As Detective Harrison turned the brass key in the final lock, the heavy door swung open to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness. The smell hit them first, a metallic organic odor that every experienced officer recognized immediately. It was the smell of death, but underneath it was something else, something that made Sarah's stomach lurch. It was the clean, antiseptic smell of a professional butcher shop. Detective Harrison led the way down the steep stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was larger than the shop above, clearly excavated and expanded over many years. What they found at the bottom defied immediate comprehension. The space had been converted into a sophisticated butchering facility that rivaled any commercial operation. Stainless steel tables dominated the center of the room, equipped with drainage systems and specialized lighting. Along the walls stood industrial refrigeration units, meat grinders, packaging equipment, and rows of knives arranged with the same obsessive precision as those in the shop above. But it was what lay on the tables that sent Officer Rodriguez running back up the stairs to vomit in the alley behind the building. Human remains in various stages of processing were arranged across the workspace with the methodical care of a master craftsman. Some bodies had been completely dismembered and prepared for packaging, while others showed the early stages of Heinrich's grotesque artistry. The remains appeared to be from at least 12 different individuals, each treated with the same professional respect. Heinrich showed the pork in his display cases. "Upstairs. Jesus Christ." Detective Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible in the underground chamber of horrors. "How long has this been going on?" The evidence technician began photographing the scene, his camera flash illuminating corners that revealed even more disturbing details. Eye charts hung on the walls showing different cuts of meat, but the diagrams weren't of pigs or cattle. They were anatomical drawings of human bodies marked with butcher's terminology. Near one of the refrigeration units, Detective Harrison discovered Heinrich's record-keeping system. Detailed logs documented each victim with the same Germanic precision Heinrich brought to his legitimate business. Names, dates, physical descriptions, and most disturbing of all, detailed notes about the quality and taste characteristics of different individuals. October 15, 1983. Male, approximately 25 years old. Excellent marbling, read one entry. Customers responded very positively to the shoulder roasts. Note, younger subjects provide superior tenderness. The logs went back 20 years, coinciding exactly with Heinrich's ownership of the butcher shop. Entry after entry documented a systematic operation that had fed human flesh to the unsuspecting residents of Willowbrook for 2 decades. Sarah Chen stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her mind struggling to process the implications. Every family dinner, every church potluck, every celebration that featured Heinrich's famous pork had been built on an unthinkable deception. The entire community had been unknowingly consuming human flesh, praising Heinrich for the very thing that should have horrified them. Detective Harrison radioed for additional units and the county coroner. This had instantly become the largest crime scene in the county's history, requiring forensic experts, federal assistance, and resources that tiny Willowbrook had never needed before. Upstairs, Heinrich sat motionless in his office, surrounded by the photographs of satisfied customers and community events that had defined his respectable facade. When Detective Harrison emerged from the basement, Heinrich looked up with an expression of resigned acceptance. "How many people?" Detective Harrison asked, his voice hollow with shock. 47, Heinrich replied without hesitation. Over 20 years, 47 individuals contributed to my work. I kept detailed records. I was always professional, always respectful of their sacrifice. The casual way Heinrich discussed his victims as contributions made Detective Harrison's blood run cold. This wasn't the ravings of a madman, it was the methodical confession of someone who viewed his actions as a legitimate business practice. As word spread through Willowbrook that afternoon, the community's comfortable world began to collapse. The butcher they had trusted, respected, and relied upon for 2 decades had been serving them the flesh of missing persons, drifters, and runaways who had disappeared without a trace. Heinrich Mueller was led away in handcuffs as news vans began arriving from neighboring cities. His shop, which had been the heart of Willowbrook's daily life, was now a crime scene that would haunt the community forever. The brass key that had protected his secret for 20 years was now evidence in what would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. FBI agent Patricia Valdez arrived in Willowbrook the morning after Heinrich's arrest, carrying with her a thick folder of cold cases that had suddenly taken on new significance. The local police department, overwhelmed by the scope of the investigation, had requested federal assistance within hours of discovering the basement chamber. Agent Valdez spread the missing persons files across the conference table in the Willowbrook Police Department's small meeting room. Detective Harrison sat across from her, still processing the horror he'd witnessed the day before. We'd been tracking a pattern of disappearances across 3 counties for the past 15 years, Agent Valdez explained, her voice clinical and professional. Transients, hitchhikers, people living on the margins of society. The kind of individuals who often disappear without generating much investigative attention. She opened the first file, revealing the photograph of a young man with hollow eyes and weathered clothing. Timothy Rodriguez, age 24, last seen hitchhiking near the interstate in 1987. Family reported him missing, but he had a history of disappearing for months at a time. The case went cold within 6 months. Detective Harrison studied the photograph, then checked it against Heinrich's meticulous records. March 15, 1987. Heinrich's notes describe a young male, lean build, suitable for specialty cuts. The timing matches perfectly. Agent Valdez nodded grimly and opened another file. Jennifer Walsh, 19, runaway from Chicago. Last seen at a truck stop 40 miles from here in 1991. She'd been living on the streets for 2 years, supporting herself through prostitution. When she disappeared, most people assumed she'd either moved on or met with an occupational hazard. The pattern became clear as they worked through file after file. Heinrich had systematically targeted society's most vulnerable individuals. People whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive investigations, whose families might assume they'd simply moved on to another town or met with misfortune on the road. He was incredibly careful in his selection process. Agent Valdez observed, never took anyone local, never targeted people who would be immediately missed. He understood that homeless individuals and transients exist in a kind of social invisibility. Detective Harrison pulled out Heinrich's business ledger, the same one Sarah Chen had reviewed during her inspection. Look at this. His sales records show consistent volume throughout the 20-year period, but his supplier invoices don't match the quantity he was moving. We should have caught this discrepancy years ago. Heinrich was supplementing his legitimate pork supplies with human flesh, Agent Valdez said, probably mixing it in gradually, using his skills to mask the difference in taste and texture. Most customers would never know they were consuming anything other than high-quality pork. The thought sent chills through both investigators. Heinrich had been serving a mixture of legitimate pork and human flesh to unsuspecting families for 2 decades. Children had grown up eating his products. Holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, church potlucks, all tainted by his systematic cannibalism. Agent Valdez opened another file, this one containing the photograph of a teenage girl with defiant eyes and prematurely aged features. Maria Santos, 16, runaway from Denver. She'd been working the truck stops along I-70, trying to make it to the East Coast. Disappeared in November 1994, Detective Harrison found the corresponding entry in Heinrich's records: female, young, excellent quality throughout. Customer satisfaction extremely high with the holiday preparations. The clinical nature of Heinrich's notes about a 16-year-old girl made his stomach turn. The most disturbing aspect, Agent Valdez continued, is how systematic this operation was. Heinrich didn't kill in passion or rage. This was a calculated business decision. He saw an opportunity to reduce his operating costs while providing a product his customers praised. They continued matching files to Heinrich's records, building a comprehensive picture of his victim selection process. Heinrich had developed relationships with truckers and others who frequented the highways near Willowbrook. He'd learned when and where vulnerable individuals were most likely to appear, and he'd positioned himself to take advantage of their desperation. Robert Chen, no relation to our health inspector, age 31, Vietnam veteran struggling with addiction and PTSD. Last seen at a gas station near Willowbrook in 1989. Agent Valdez read. His family searched for months, but he'd been drifting since his discharge from the military. Heinrich's notes on Robert were particularly detailed. Military background suggested excellent physical conditioning. Meat quality superior to typical subjects. Recommend targeting similar demographics in future acquisitions. The cold, business-like language Heinrich used to describe human beings made the investigation even more disturbing. He'd reduced people to commodity assessments, evaluating their worth based solely on the quality of meat they would provide. Detective Harrison stood up from the table, needing a moment to process the scope of what they were uncovering. How do we tell their families? How do we explain that their missing loved ones were murdered and then served to paying customers for 20 years? Agent Valdez had worked dozens of serial killer cases throughout her career, but Heinrich's crimes represented something uniquely horrifying. We start with the families we can locate and work from there. Some of these people have been missing for decades. Their families deserve to know what happened, even if the truth is almost impossible to bear. The investigation was revealing that Heinrich had been far more than a serial killer. He'd been operating a systematic cannibalism business that had fed on society's most vulnerable members while serving their flesh to a community that had trusted him implicitly. As news of the victim identifications began to leak to the media, Willowbrook found itself at the center of a national horror story. The families of the identified victims started arriving in town, seeking answers and justice for loved ones they'd been searching for, in some cases for decades. Heinrich Mueller had built his reputation on providing the finest meat in 3 counties. Now the community was learning that his secret ingredient had been the flesh of 47 human beings, whose only crime was existing on the margins of society. Amanda Foster, forensic psychologist with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, sat across from Heinrich Mueller in the stark interview room of the county jail. 3 days had passed since his arrest, and Heinrich appeared remarkably calm for a man facing multiple murder charges. His hands rested peacefully in his lap, and his expression held the same patient attention he'd once given to customers selecting their weekly meat order. "Mr. Mueller, I'd like to understand how this began," Dr. Foster said, her voice professionally neutral. "Can you tell me about your first victim?" Heinrich considered the question with the same careful deliberation he'd once used to select the perfect cut of pork. October 1983. A young man, maybe 25 years, he was hitchhiking near the interstate. Looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. I offered him work, told him I needed help with some heavy lifting at the shop. What happened then? I gave him a good meal first. It seemed respectful. He was grateful, kept thanking me for the kindness. Heinrich's expression remained eerily peaceful. When he fell asleep in the back room, I used the bolt gun. Very quick, very humane, no suffering. Dr. Foster made notes while maintaining her composure, though Heinrich's casual description of premeditated murder chilled her. Why did you decide to process his remains for consumption? Heinrich tilted his head slightly, as if the question puzzled him. Waste is sinful, Dr. Foster. This young man had given his life, inadvertently, but still, to simply dispose of him would have been disrespectful. By preparing him properly with skill and care, I was honoring his sacrifice. But you sold his flesh to customers who thought they were buying pork. They were buying the finest quality meat available in 3 counties. Heinrich replied with unmistakable pride. I maintained the same standards, the same attention to quality, whether the source was traditional livestock or alternative protein. Foster had interviewed dozens of serial killers throughout her career, but Heinrich's matter-of-fact attitude toward cannibalistic murder was unlike anything she'd encountered. Most killers showed some awareness of their crime's severity, even if they tried to justify their actions. Heinrich spoke as if he'd been operating a legitimate specialty food business. Tell me about your record-keeping. Why did you document everything so meticulously? Heinrich's face brightened slightly. Quality control, Dr. Foster. Any serious craftsman maintains detailed records. I needed to track which preparation methods produced the best results, which demographics provided superior meat quality, which cuts proved most popular with customers. He gestured toward the folder containing his confiscated journals. For instance, I discovered that individuals with active lifestyles, construction workers, farm laborers, produced meat with excellent marbling and flavor. Sedentary individuals were more suitable for ground preparations or slow cooking applications. The clinical way Heinrich discussed human beings as livestock made Dr. Foster's stomach turn, but she pressed on. Did you ever feel guilty about deceiving your customers? Heinrich looked genuinely confused by the question. Deceiving them? Foster, my customers received exactly what I promised. The finest quality meat prepared with skill and respect, fairly priced. The fact that some of my protein sources were non-traditional doesn't change the quality of the product I delivered, but they didn't know they were consuming human flesh. Would knowing have changed the taste? The nutritional urinal, the satisfaction they derived from family meals? Heinrich shook his head. I provided a service, Dr. Foster. I fed this community for 20 years. I brought families together around dinner tables. I contributed to celebrations, holidays, moments of joy. The source material is irrelevant compared to the happiness I created. Dr. Foster realized she was dealing with a form of psychopathy, unlike anything in the literature. Heinrich had completely reframed his crimes in his own mind, viewing himself not as a serial killer, but as an innovative businessman who had solved supply problems through creative sourcing. What about the victims' families? The people who loved those individuals you killed? Heinrich's expression grew thoughtful. I understand their pain, truly. But these were people living on the margins, Dr. Foster. Homeless individuals, addicts, runaways. Many had no families, or families who had given up searching for them. In a sense, I gave their lives meaning. They became part of something larger. They nourished an entire community. You don't see yourself as a murderer? I see myself as someone who recognized opportunity where others saw only problems. The homeless population, the transients passing through, they were a wasted resource. I transformed them into something valuable, something that brought joy to hundreds of families. Dr. Foster closed her notebook, recognizing that traditional psychological frameworks couldn't adequately explain Heinrich's worldview. He had constructed an elaborate moral justification for systematic cannibalism, viewing his crimes through the lens of business efficiency and community service. One final question, Mr. Mueller. If you could do it again, would you change anything? Heinrich considered this carefully. Perhaps I would have expanded operations sooner. Other communities could have benefited from my innovations. I was too cautious, too focused on perfecting my craft in a single location. As Dr. Foster left the interview room, she realized that Heinrich Mueller represented something uniquely terrifying in the annals of criminal psychology. He wasn't a madman driven by rage or sexual compulsion. He was a methodical businessman who had identified an opportunity and pursued it with Germanic efficiency for 20 years. The community of Willowbrook had trusted Heinrich not just with their food, but with their most sacred gatherings. He had provided the centerpiece for countless family dinners, holiday celebrations, and community events. And throughout it all, he had maintained his composure, his customer service, his reputation for quality and reliability. Heinrich Mueller had turned cannibalism into a successful business model, and he genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. The Willowbrook High School gymnasium had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. 3 days after Heinrich Mueller's arrest, Mayor Patricia Webb called an emergency town meeting to address the crisis that had shattered their community's sense of safety and identity. Nearly 800 residents packed into the space, their faces bearing expressions of shock, horror, and barely contained panic. Margaret Thompson sat in the third row, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. For 20 years, she had been one of Heinrich's most loyal customers, regularly praising his exceptional pork to friends and neighbors. Now the thought of every meal she'd prepared, every family dinner centered around Heinrich's meat, made her physically ill. "I fed it to my grandchildren," she whispered to her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "Every Sunday dinner, every holiday. My God, what have we done?" Mayor Webb stepped to the makeshift podium, her usual political composure replaced by visible anguish. She had eaten Heinrich's meat at countless community functions, had personally thanked him for his generous donations to local charities. The weight of the community's collective horror pressed down on her shoulder. "I know we're all struggling to process what we've learned," she began, her voice barely steady. "The county health department has assured us that there is no ongoing health risk. Anyone who consumed products from Mueller's shop should consult their physician if they have concern." A voice from the back of the gymnasium called out, "Health risk? Lady, we've been eating people for 20 years. Our children grew up on human flesh." The comment triggered an eruption of voices throughout the crowd. Parents clutched their children closer, elderly residents wept openly, and several people rushed from the gymnasium to vomit in the parking lot. The careful social fabric that had held Willowbrook together for generations was unraveling in real time. Pastor Williams rose from his seat in the front row, his face ashen. Heinrich had donated meat for countless church functions over the year: the annual Easter potluck, the Christmas dinner for needy families, the fellowship meals after Sunday services, all of it contaminated by Heinrich's grotesque deception. "How could we not know?" Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying the weight of spiritual crisis. "How could evil hide among us so completely?" I blessed that man's contributions. I thanked God for his generosity. Dr. Elizabeth Morris, the town's only physician, had set up a makeshift medical station in the school's nurses. She'd been fielding calls from panicked residents since Heinrich's arrest, trying to provide medical guidance for a situation no medical school had prepared her to handle. "From a purely medical standpoint," Morris announced, "consuming properly cooked human flesh doesn't pose significant disease risks beyond those of any meat product. The psychological trauma, however, is something we're all going to need help processing." Her clinical explanation did little to comfort the crowd. Sarah Martinez, a young mother who had fed her toddler countless meals featuring Heinrich's meat, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "You're talking about this like it's normal, like we accidentally ate the wrong kind of pork. These were people, human beings with families who loved them." She turned to address the crowd. "I used to brag about Heinrich's meat to other mothers. I recommended him to everyone. I was so proud of the healthy meals I was giving my children." The gymnasium fell silent as the full weight of their collective participation in Heinrich's crimes settled over them. They weren't just victims of deception, they had been unwitting accomplices in systematic cannibalism, praising the very thing that should have horrified them. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store next to Heinrich's shop, struggled to his feet. "I knew Heinrich for 20 years. We talked every morning when I opened my store. He helped me carry heavy items, invited me to his shop for coffee. He seemed like the most decent man in town." "That's what makes this so terrifying," replied Janet Foster, the high school principal. "If we couldn't recognize evil when it was serving us dinner, how can we trust anyone? How do we explain this to our children? How do we live with the knowledge of what we've done? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Willowbrook had prided itself on being the kind of community where neighbors looked out for each other, where trust ran deep, and strangers were welcomed with open arms. Heinrich had perverted that trust, using their good faith to hide crimes beyond imagination. Mayor Webb attempted to regain control of the meeting. The county has set up counseling services for anyone who needs support. The FBI has assured us that their investigation will be thorough and that justice will be served. We need to focus on healing and moving forward. Moving forward? Shouted Bill Martinez, Sarah's husband. How do you move forward from finding out you've been feeding your family human flesh for years? How do you go to sleep at night, knowing what you've unknowingly participated in? The meeting devolved into dozens of smaller conversations as neighbors turned to each other, seeking comfort or understanding that none of them could provide. Some residents blamed themselves for not being more observant, for not questioning Heinrich's consistently superior product. Others directed their anger at local authorities for failing to detect the pattern of missing persons or the inconsistencies in Heinrich's business operations. As the evening wore on, it became clear that Willowbrook faced a crisis that extended far beyond criminal justice. The community's fundamental understanding of itself had been shattered. They were no longer the innocent small town where everyone knew everyone and neighbors could be trusted implicitly. Heinrich Mueller had transformed them all into unwilling participants in his horror, and the knowledge of their innocence could never fully absolve them of the weight they would carry forever. Every family dinner, every celebration, every moment of satisfaction they derived from Heinrich's products had been built on a foundation of systematic murder and cannibalism. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with the recognition that healing from this trauma would take years, perhaps generations. Some residents were already talking about leaving Willowbrook entirely, unable to live with the memories that now tainted every street corner and familiar face. As people filed out of the gymnasium into the cool April night, they faced the terrible knowledge that their community would never be the same, and neither would they. Dr. Amanda Foster spread Heinrich Mueller's childhood photographs across the conference table at the FBI field office. The images showed a blond boy with earnest eyes standing beside his parents in what appeared to be a modest German farmhouse. The innocence captured in these faded photographs seemed impossible to reconcile with the monster Heinrich had become. Heinrich Wolfgang Mueller, born March 15, 1948 in Bavaria, she explained to the assembled team of investigators. His early years were marked by the chaos of post-war Germany. His father, Klaus Mueller, was a local butcher who struggled to rebuild his business after the Allied bombing destroyed most of their town. Agent Valdez studied one photograph showing young Heinrich helping his father in what remained of their family butcher shop. When did the first signs of antisocial behavior appear? Dr. Foster consulted her notes from interviews with Heinrich's surviving relatives and childhood acquaintances. According to his aunt, Heinrich showed unusual fascination with the slaughter and butchering process from a very early age. While other children were repulsed by the blood and gore, Heinrich watched with intense interest. His father apparently praised him for having the stomach for the family trade. The psychological profile emerging from Foster's investigation painted a picture of methodical evil developing over decades. Heinrich hadn't been born a monster, but circumstances and choices had shaped him into something uniquely horrifying. His mother died when he was 12, Dr. Foster continued. Tuberculosis was still common in post-war Germany, especially among malnourished populations. Heinrich's father became increasingly harsh afterward, drinking heavily and demanding perfection in Heinrich's work at the shop. Detective Harrison leaned forward. Any history of violence toward animals or other children? That's where the case becomes more disturbing. Heinrich's schoolmates described him as quiet but helpful. He never tortured animals or showed the typical early signs of violent psychopathy. Instead, he seemed to develop an almost reverent attitude toward death and consumption. His aunt mentioned that he would pray over the animals before his father slaughtered them. Dr. Foster opened Heinrich's immigration file from when Klaus Mueller died in 1977. Heinrich sold the family business and used the money to emigrate to America. He specifically chose a small rural community where he could practice his trade while building what he called a proper life. The psychological evaluation revealed that Heinrich's crimes weren't driven by sexual sadism or rage, the typical motivators for serial killers. Instead, they stemmed from a deeply warped sense of practicality and community service that made him far more dangerous than conventional predators. Heinrich genuinely believed he was serving his community, Dr. Foster explained. In his mind, he was solving two problems simultaneously, disposing of societal waste in the form of transients and homeless individuals, while providing his customers with superior quality meat. He saw it as elegant efficiency. Agent Valdez shook her head in disbelief. But how did he maintain this delusion for 20 years? How did he function normally while systematically murdering people? That's what makes Heinrich so uniquely terrifying. He compartmentalized his activities completely. During business hours, he was the helpful neighborhood butcher. In the evenings and weekends, he hunted for victims with the same methodical approach he used for legitimate business operations. He kept separate mental categories for Heinrich the community member and Heinrich the procurement specialist. Dr. Foster showed them excerpts from Heinrich's personal journals, which revealed a man who took genuine pride in both aspects of his double life. His entries about community events and customer satisfaction were written in the same tone as his clinical observations about victim selection and processing techniques. "Look at this entry from Christmas 1995, she said, pointing to a page covered in Heinrich's neat handwriting. Mrs. Thompson's Christmas dinner was a tremendous success. Her family praised the holiday roast extensively. I am deeply satisfied knowing that I contributed to their joy and togetherness." Note, the December acquisition processed exceptionally well for holiday preparation. The casual way Heinrich discussed murder in the context of customer service illustrated the complete moral inversion that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. He had convinced himself that killing homeless individuals was a form of community service, transforming waste into something that brought families together. Heinrich created an elaborate ethical framework to justify his crimes. Dr. Foster continued. He told himself that his victims were already lost, forgotten by society. By killing them painlessly and processing them skillfully, he was giving their deaths meaning and purpose. Detective Harrison studied Heinrich's photograph from his 1983 business license. How did no one notice the psychological disconnect? He was charming enough to build a loyal customer base, active in community events, respected by local leaders. That's precisely what made Heinrich so dangerous. Unlike disorganized killers who gradually lose their ability to function sexually, Heinrich used his crimes to enhance his social standing. Every satisfied customer, every community donation, every act of apparent kindness reinforced his belief that his methods were not only acceptable but admirable. Dr. Foster's analysis revealed that Heinrich had created what she termed virtuous cannibalism, a psychological framework where systematic murder and consumption became acts of community service and resource management. This delusion had protected him from guilt, while enabling him to maintain perfect social camouflage. The most frightening aspect of this case, Dr. Foster concluded, is that Heinrich Mueller proves evil can be methodical, patient, and socially successful. He didn't fit any existing profile of serial killers or cannibals. He created his own category of crime by combining systematic murder with genuine community involvement. The team sat in uncomfortable silence, processing the implications of Dr. Foster's analysis. Heinrich Mueller had spent 20 years proving that monsters could hide, not just in plain sight, but in positions of trust and community leadership, serving their victims to the very people who should have been protected from such horror. Agent Valdez was reviewing security footage from the alley behind Heinrich's butcher shop when she noticed something that made her freeze the frame. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. on March 8. The grainy black and white image showed Heinrich loading what appeared to be a heavy bundle into his truck, but he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him, partially obscured by shadows, but clearly helping with the disposal. The person was shorter than Heinrich, stockier, wearing a baseball cap that hid their face from the camera's angle. Agent Valdez enhanced the image as much as possible, but the identity remained unclear. She called Detective Harrison immediately. "We need to look at all the security footage again." Heinrich had help. Within hours, they'd assembled a team to review every available surveillance recording from businesses near the butcher shop. The tedious work paid off when they found clearer footage from a camera across the street, dated 6 months earlier. This time, the accomplice's face was partially visible as he looked toward the street before helping Heinrich load another suspicious bundle. "Hans Weber," Detective Harrison said, recognizing the face immediately. "He runs the homeless outreach program downtown. I've worked with him on several cases involving transient populations." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Hans Weber had been operating a non-profit organization dedicated to helping Willowbrook's homeless population for over 15 years. He organized meal programs, coordinated temporary shelter arrangements, and maintained extensive contact with the transient individuals who passed through the area. Agent Valdez felt sick as the implications became clear. He was using his outreach work as a hunting ground. He had access to vulnerable people, gained their trust, and then delivered them to Heinrich. They brought Hans in for questioning that afternoon. Unlike Heinrich's calm composure during interrogation, Hans fell apart the moment he was confronted with the security footage. His face went white, his hands began shaking uncontrollably, and within minutes he was sobbing. "I never meant for it to happen," Hans gasped between tears. "It started as just helping Heinrich with heavy lifting. I didn't know what was in those bundles at first." Detective Harrison leaned forward. "When did you realize what Heinrich was doing?" "Maybe 6 months after I started helping. I saw him wrapping something that looked like a person. I confronted him, and he showed me the basement." Hans covered his face with his hands. He explained everything so calmly, like it made perfect sense. "He said we were cleaning up the streets, helping people who were suffering." Agent Valdez studied Hans's body language. His distress appeared genuine, but 15 years of complicity suggested something deeper than reluctant assistance. "How did you select the victims?" Hans's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I knew who wouldn't be missed. The long-time addicts, the ones without family contact, the people who'd been on the streets for years. Heinrich never pressured me, but I started pointing them out, mentioning when someone was particularly isolated or desperate." The confession revealed the full scope of their operation. Hans had used his position of trust within the homeless community to identify ideal victims while maintaining his reputation as their advocate. He'd built relationships with vulnerable individuals specifically to assess their suitability for Heinrich's purposes. "We told ourselves we were being merciful," Hans continued, his voice thick with self-disgust. "These people were suffering, addicted, forgotten. Heinrich promised their deaths would be quick and painless, that their lives would finally serve a purpose by nourishing families." Detective Harrison had seen enough criminal partnerships to recognize the dynamic at play. Heinrich was the dominant partner, the visionary who conceived and directed their operation. Hans was the enabler, the one who provided access and justification while avoiding direct involvement in the killing. "Heinrich made it sound noble," Hans said. "He talked about waste, about efficiency, about serving the community. He showed me his customer satisfaction records, the thank you notes from families. He convinced me we were doing good work." Agent Valdez pressed further. "But you knew they were consuming human flesh. Heinrich was so skilled, so professional. The customers loved the meat, praised its quality, fed it to their children with gratitude. If they were happy, if their families were nourished, did the source really matter?" Hans looked up with desperate eyes. That's what Heinrich taught me to believe. The interview revealed that Hans had been instrumental in the operation's success, but he'd maintained psychological distance from the actual murders by focusing on his outreach work. He'd continued operating his homeless program while secretly identifying victims, creating a perfect cover that allowed him to approach vulnerable individuals without suspicion. How many people did you help Heinrich select? Hans was quiet for a long time before answering. 47. All of them. I knew everyone Heinrich killed. I'd talked to them, gained their trust, assessed their situations. Some of them thought I was their friend. The confession shattered any remaining illusions about Heinrich operating alone. Hans Weber had been an essential partner in systematic cannibalism, using his charitable work to mask his role in identifying and delivering victims to their death. As news of Hans's arrest spread through Willowbrook, the community faced a second wave of horror. The man they'd trusted to care for their most vulnerable neighbors had been systematically betraying them to a cannibal. Every charitable donation to Hans's program, every volunteer hour spent supporting his work, had unknowingly supported a hunting operation that fed human flesh to their community. The revelation that Heinrich had an accomplice transformed the investigation from a single serial killer case into something far more complex and disturbing. Two respected community members had collaborated for 15 years to turn Willowbrook's compassion for the homeless into a supply chain for systematic murder and cannibalism. Hans Weber had proven that evil could hide not just behind respectability, but behind genuine charitable work, using society's most noble impulses to enable its most horrific crimes. FBI cybercrime specialist agent Maria Santos discovered the encrypted files on Heinrich's computer 3 weeks into the investigation. Hidden behind layers of security software were folders containing hundreds of emails exchanged with individuals across multiple states. The correspondence dating back to 1995 revealed a network that made the Willowbrook operation seem small by comparison. "Look at this," Agent Santos told the assembled task force, displaying an email thread on the conference room screen. Heinrich was corresponding with someone called Alpine Meats in Colorado. They're discussing special processing techniques and alternative protein sources. Agent Valdez studied the coded language in the email. Terms like special cuts, seasonal harvesting, and quality demographic selection appeared frequently throughout the correspondence. What looked like routine business communications between meat suppliers revealed themselves as discussions about systematic human consumption. Detective Harrison read over an email from December 2001. Heinrich is giving advice about winter preparations and recommends targeting individuals with outdoor exposure for enhanced flavor profiles. This is a how-to guide for cannibalizing homeless people during cold weather. The investigation expanded rapidly as FBI field offices in Colorado, Oregon, and Michigan received warrants to investigate the businesses mentioned in Heinrich's correspondence. Within 48 hours, agents had arrested 3 additional butchers operating similar schemes in their respective communities. Agent Santos displayed a map showing the locations of the connected operations. "We've identified active networks in Denver, Portland, and Grand Rapids. Each operation appears to have been running independently, but sharing techniques and victim selection strategies through encrypted communications. The Denver operation, run by Klaus Hoffmann, no relation to Heinrich despite sharing a German background, had been active for 12 years. Like Heinrich, Klaus operated a respected neighborhood butcher shop while systematically targeting the city's homeless population. His basement facility was nearly identical to Heinrich's, complete with industrial equipment and meticulous record-keeping. Klaus was Heinrich's most active correspondent, Agent Santos explained. They exchanged detailed recipes for preparation methods, discussed optimal storage techniques, and compared customer satisfaction ratings like legitimate business partners. The Portland operation proved even more disturbing. Janet Morrison, a 52-year-old woman who ran what appeared to be a specialty organic meat shop, had been collaborating with a local social worker to identify victims from the city's mental health facilities. Her customer base consisted primarily of wealthy, health-conscious consumers who paid premium prices for what they believed was ethically sourced organic protein. Morrison was targeting individuals with severe mental illness, Agent Valdez reported after reviewing the Portland files. Her accomplice identified patients who had minimal family contact and poor medication compliance. They convinced victims they were being enrolled in a residential treatment program. The Michigan operation revealed the most sophisticated aspect of the network. Robert Chen operated a high-end restaurant in Grand Rapids while running a side business supplying artisanal meats to exclusive clients throughout the Midwest. His correspondence with Heinrich included discussions about expanding into what they termed franchise opportunities. Agent Santos displayed emails from 2002 that outlined plans for a more formal network structure. They were developing a business model for systematic expansion. Heinrich was working on a manual for new operators, complete with victim selection criteria, processing techniques, and customer development strategies. The manual, found in Heinrich's files, read like a legitimate business plan. It included sections on market analysis, quality control standards, and risk management procedures. The clinical approach to systematic cannibalism was more disturbing than any rage-driven serial killer case the FBI had encountered. "Look at this section," Detective Harrison said, reading from Heinrich's draft manual. "Successful operations require 3 key elements: reliable victim procurement, professional processing facilities, and established customer relationships. Operators should focus on communities with significant transient populations and strong traditions of local food sourcing." The investigation revealed that the network had been sharing more than techniques and advice. Financial records showed money transfers between the operations, suggesting they were purchasing victims from each other when local supplies were insufficient. Agent Valdez discovered shipping manifests that made her stomach turn. They were literally trading human beings like livestock. Heinrich shipped specialty products to Morrison in Portland on at least 6 occasions. The victims were transported in refrigerated trucks, along with legitimate meat shipments. The scope of the network expanded beyond the original 4 operators. Email correspondence mentioned contacts in Texas, Florida, and California who were interested in joining the operation. Some were established butchers looking to reduce costs, while others were entrepreneurs seeking to enter the specialty food market. "We're looking at what could have become a nationwide cannibalism network," Agent Santos concluded. If Heinrich hadn't been caught during that routine inspection, this operation could have expanded to dozens of communities across the country. The psychological profiles of the network members revealed a disturbing consistency. Unlike traditional serial killers, these individuals were motivated by business opportunities rather than psychological compulsions. They'd identified a market inefficiency, the abundance of disposable people versus the demand for premium meat, and developed a systematic solution. As arrests continued across multiple states, investigators realized they were dismantling something unprecedented in criminal history, a business network that had industrialized cannibalism while maintaining complete social respectability in their community. The revelation that Heinrich's operation was part of a larger network transformed the Willowbrook case from an isolated horror story into evidence of a systematic threat to vulnerable populations nationwide. Communities across the country began questioning their own trusted food suppliers, wondering how many other Heinrich Muellers might be hiding behind friendly smiles and quality service. The encrypted correspondence revealed plans for a national convention where network members could meet in person to share techniques and coordinate expansion strategies. Heinrich had been developing presentation materials for what he called the future of alternative protein sourcing in American communities. The case had evolved from investigating one monster into dismantling an entire shadow industry built on the systematic murder and consumption of society's most vulnerable members. District Attorney Catherine Walsh stood in her office, surrounded by bankers' boxes containing what prosecutors were calling the most comprehensive evidence collection in state history. 6 months had passed since Heinrich Mueller's arrest, and the case had grown into a legal nightmare that would challenge every aspect of the criminal justice system. "We have over 10,000 pieces of physical evidence," she explained to her prosecution team. Heinrich's journals, victim identification materials, DNA evidence from the basement facility, financial records, correspondence with his network partners, and testimony from one. The challenge isn't proving guilt, it's presenting this horror in a way that doesn't traumatize the jury beyond their ability to function. Lead prosecutor James Morrison reviewed the victim list that now spanned 4 states and 23 years. 47 confirmed murders in Willowbrook, plus Heinrich's admitted involvement in victim procurement for the other network locations. We're seeking the death penalty on all counts, plus charges for conspiracy, kidnapping and operating a criminal enterprise. The legal team faced unprecedented challenges in preparing their case. How do you present evidence of systematic cannibalism to a jury without causing psychological damage? How do you explain to families that their loved ones were not only murdered, but consumed by their neighbors for decades? Victim Services Coordinator Lisa Chen, no relation to Health Inspector Sarah Chen, worked with families who had traveled from across the country to seek justice for their missing relatives. The waiting room in the courthouse had become a shrine of grief, lined with photographs of the 47 identified victims and dozens more who remained missing. These families have been searching for answers for decades, Lisa explained to the prosecution team. Some of them never gave up hope that their loved ones might still be alive somewhere. Learning the truth has been devastating, but they deserve to see justice served. Margaret Thompson had been subpoenaed as a witness, forced to testify about her 20 years as Heinrich's loyal customer. The prospect of describing her unknowing consumption of human flesh in front of cameras and courtroom observers filled her with dread. "I don't know how I can face those families," she told her attorney. "How do you look someone in the eye and tell them you enjoyed eating their child, that you praised the taste, that you recommended the meat to your friends?" Defense attorney Robert Hayes faced an impossible task. His client had confessed to 47 murders and shown no remorse during months of psychiatric evaluation. Heinrich's detailed journals documented every aspect of his crimes with pride rather than shame. "We're going to argue diminished capacity due to severe psychological disorders developed during childhood trauma in post-war Germany," Hayes explained to his team. "It's our only option." Heinrich's mental state makes him incapable of understanding the moral wrongness of his action. The psychiatric evaluations told a different story. Dr. Amanda Foster's comprehensive assessment concluded that Heinrich was legally sane, fully aware of his actions, and capable of distinguishing right from wrong. He simply disagreed with society's moral framework regarding the value of homeless individuals and the ethics of alternative protein sourcing. "Heinrich doesn't meet any criteria for legal insanity," Dr. Foster reported to the court. "He planned his crimes carefully, took elaborate precautions to avoid detection, and maintained normal social relationships for decades. His moral framework is severely distorted, but his cognitive abilities are completely intact." Judge Patricia Martinez had requested transfer to a different jurisdiction, but the case was too large and complex to move. She'd ordered extensive jury screening to identify individuals capable of hearing evidence of systematic cannibalism without becoming too traumatized to deliberate fairly. "We've screened over 800 potential jurors," she reported to both legal teams. "Many people simply cannot psychologically handle this case. Others have already formed strong opinions based on media coverage. Finding 12 impartial jurors who can function after hearing this evidence is proving extremely difficult." The media attention had transformed Willowbrook into a circus. Reporters from around the world had descended on the small town, interviewing residents, filming the former butcher shop, and creating documentaries about America's most shocking serial killer case. Prosecutor Morrison reviewed his opening statement for the 20th time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case will challenge everything you believe about human nature and community trust. Heinrich Mueller spent 20 years proving that monsters can hide behind helpful smiles and quality service while feeding us the flesh of our most vulnerable neighbors. The prosecution's evidence room resembled a macabre museum. Heinrich's knives, cutting boards, and processing equipment were tagged and catalogued. His journals filled multiple display cases, open to particularly damning entries where he discussed victim selection and customer satisfaction with equal enthusiasm. The defendant's own words will convict him, Morrison told his team. He documented everything with pride. These aren't the ravings of a madman, they're the business records of someone who turned systematic murder into a profitable enterprise. Hans Weber's cooperation agreement required him to testify against Heinrich in exchange for life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. His detailed knowledge of their victim selection process would provide crucial testimony about the systematic nature of their crimes. Weber's testimony will show this wasn't random killing, Morrison explained. They developed specific criteria for victim selection, maintained detailed records of their success rates, and continuously refined their methods based on customer feedback. The courthouse had been equipped with additional security as threats poured in from around the country. Some people wanted to ensure Heinrich received the death penalty, while others threatened violence against the community members who had unknowingly consumed human flesh. As the trial date approached, everyone involved recognized they were about to participate in legal proceedings that would redefine public understanding of evil. Heinrich Mueller had created a new category of crime that combined serial murder, cannibalism, fraud, and community betrayal into something unprecedented in American criminal history. The prosecution was confident in their case, but they knew that convicting Heinrich was only the beginning. The real challenge would be helping a traumatized community and countless victims' families find some measure of peace after learning that their trust had been used to enable decades of systematic horror. Hans Weber sat in the county jail's interview room, his hands shaking as he reached for the paper cup of water placed before him. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, his attorney had convinced him that full cooperation was his only path to avoiding the death penalty. What emerged from his confession would horrify even investigators who thought they had heard everything. There were more victims than Heinrich recorded. Hans said, his voice barely above a whisper. The journals you found only document the ones we processed completely. There were others, mistakes, experiments that didn't work out. Agent Valdez leaned forward, her stomach already churning at the implications. How many more people are we talking about, Hans? Maybe 15, 20 additional individuals over the years. Heinrich was a perfectionist. If the meat quality wasn't up to his standards, or if something went wrong with the processing, he would dispose of the remains differently. The revelation meant that Heinrich's victim count could exceed 60 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But worse than the numbers was Hans's description of Heinrich's evolution from opportunistic killer to systematic predator. In the beginning, Heinrich would only take victims who came to us, Hans continued. Homeless individuals seeking help, people passing through town. But by the late 1990s, he became more proactive. Prosecutor Morrison joined the interview session as Hans described hunting trips where Heinrich would drive to neighboring cities specifically to acquire victims. He developed relationships with other homeless outreach workers in different counties. He would volunteer at soup kitchens, help with shelter operations, always looking for suitable candidates. The methodical nature of Heinrich's victim selection revealed a level of planning that surpassed even their previous understanding. He had created detailed profiles of homeless populations across 3 states, identifying seasonal migration patterns and optimal hunting grounds. Heinrich kept maps, Hans said, his voice growing steadier as he unburdened himself of years of suppressed guilt. He marked locations where transients congregated, noted which areas had minimal police presence, tracked which missing persons cases received investigative attention. Agent Valdez requested the maps from Heinrich's confiscated materials. When they were brought to the interview room, the scope of his operation became even more disturbing. Red pins marked successful acquisition sites, Blue pins indicated locations with too much security or oversight, and green pins showed potential future hunting grounds. He was planning to expand operations, Hans continued. Heinrich wanted to establish what he called supply routes between major cities. He envisioned a network of operators who could share resources and coordinate victim acquisition across state lines. The business plan Hans described resembled a legitimate distribution company more than a serial killing operation. Heinrich had calculated optimal victim quotas, projected customer demand, and developed protocols for quality control that treated human beings like livestock inventory. Heinrich studied the meat industry extensively. Hans explained, he read trade publications, attended conferences, analyzed supply chain management techniques. He wanted to apply modern business practices to human procurement. Defense attorney Hayes had requested this interview as part of his preparation for Heinrich's diminished capacity defense, but Hans's testimony was demolishing any possibility of arguing mental illness. Everything Heinrich had done demonstrated calculated intelligence and systematic planning. Tell us about the processing facility, Prosecutor Morrison requested. How did Heinrich develop those techniques? Hans's face went pale as he described watching Heinrich perfect his methods over years of experimentation. He started with basic butchering knowledge from his father's shop in Germany, but he taught himself advanced techniques through trial and error. Heinrich treated each victim as a learning opportunity. The confession revealed that Heinrich had maintained detailed notes not just about victims and customers, but about processing innovations. He had developed proprietary techniques for aging human flesh, created spice blends that masked any taste differences from pork, and perfected packaging methods that preserved freshness during distribution. Heinrich was proud of his innovations, Hans said. He believed he was revolutionizing the meat industry by identifying an untapped protein source. He talked about writing a book someday, sharing his techniques with other entrepreneurs. Agent Valdez felt sick as Hans described Heinrich's plans for a legitimate business venture. He wanted to develop a legal framework for what he called consensual human consumption. Heinrich believed that if he could convince society to accept his methods, he could operate openly. The interview revealed Heinrich's correspondence with academic researchers, attempting to build scientific support for his practices. He had contacted anthropologists studying historical cannibalism, nutritionists researching alternative proteins, and bioethicists examining end-of-life issues. Heinrich wasn't just a killer, Hans concluded. He was trying to change society's fundamental attitudes toward human consumption. He saw himself as a pioneer who would eventually be recognized for his contributions to solving hunger and homelessness simultaneously. Prosecutor Morrison realized that Heinrich's crimes extended beyond murder and cannibalism into something resembling terrorist ideology, an attempt to fundamentally alter social norms through systematic horror disguised as community service. As Hans's confession concluded, the legal teams faced the disturbing reality that they were prosecuting not just a serial killer, but someone who had attempted to create a new form of socially acceptable cannibalism. Heinrich Mueller had spent 20 years proving that communities could be made complicit in consuming human flesh through careful manipulation of trust and quality service. The additional victims Hans revealed would never be identified, their remains disposed of when Heinrich deemed them unsuitable for his customers. They had died not just for Heinrich's twisted business model, but for his pursuit of culinary perfection in serving human flesh to families who trusted him with their most intimate gatherings. The trial would not just determine Heinrich's guilt, but confront society with uncomfortable questions about how easily trust can be weaponized and how respectability can mask the most unthinkable crimes. The courthouse steps were lined with newsreels from around the world as Heinrich Mueller's trial began on a cold January morning. Inside, Judge Patricia Martinez called the court to order while Heinrich sat calmly at the defendant's table, dressed in a simple gray suit that made him look like any other small-town businessman. District Attorney Catherine Walsh approached the jury box for her opening statement, knowing that the next few hours would challenge everything the 12 selected jurors believed about human nature and community trust. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to describe. For 20 years, Heinrich Mueller operated the most trusted butcher shop in Willowbrook. Families relied on him for their most important meal. Children grew up eating his products. Community leaders praised his generosity and craftsmanship. She paused, allowing the normalcy of that description to settle in the jury's minds before delivering the devastating truth. What those families didn't know was that Heinrich Mueller had been systematically murdering homeless individuals, transients and runaways, then processing their flesh and selling it as premium pork to customers who trusted him with their family dinners. For 2 decades, this community unknowingly consumed human flesh while praising Heinrich for providing the finest meat in 3 counties. Juror number 7, a middle-aged mother of 3, visibly paled and gripped the armrest of her chair. Several other jurors showed similar reactions, but Judge Martinez had warned them extensively about the nature of the evidence they would hear. The evidence will show that Heinrich Mueller murdered at least 47 people, possibly more. They kept detailed records of his victims, documenting their physical characteristics, the quality of meat they provided, and customer satisfaction ratings for different cuts and preparation methods. Walsh moved to the evidence table and lifted Heinrich's leather-bound journal. The defendant's own words will prove his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. These journals contain 20 years of systematic documentation, written in Heinrich's hand, describing victim selection, murder methods, processing techniques, and customer feedback. She opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud. November 12, 1995, female, approximately 30 years old, excellent marbling throughout shoulder and leg portions. Customers particularly satisfied with the holiday preparations. Mrs. Thompson's family gathering was especially successful. Note, continue targeting individuals with outdoor lifestyles for enhanced flavor profiles. The clinical way Heinrich discussed human beings as meat products sent a visible shudder through the courtroom. Margaret Thompson, seated in the gallery, closed her eyes and tried not to remember the dozens of family dinners she'd prepared using Heinrich's products. The evidence will show that Heinrich Mueller didn't kill in passion or rage, Walsh continued. These were calculated business decisions. He identified vulnerable individuals who wouldn't be missed, murdered them efficiently, and processed them with the same professional skill he applied to legitimate livestock. Defense attorney Robert Hayes watched his client's face for any reaction to the prosecution's opening, but Heinrich remained impassive, occasionally taking notes as if this were a business seminar rather than his murder trial. Walsh approached the jury box, making eye contact with each member. Heinrich Mueller betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists between community members. When families invited him to cater their celebrations, when parents fed his products to their children, when neighbors praised his generous contributions to local charities, they were unknowingly participating in systematic cannibalism. She gestured toward the gallery, where victim family members sat with photographs of their lost loved ones. Timothy Rodriguez was a 24-year-old veteran trying to get his life back together. Jennifer Walsh was a teenager who'd run away from abuse, looking for safety and a fresh start. Robert Chen was a disabled man seeking help during the coldest winter on record. Walsh's voice grew stronger as she described each victim. These weren't statistics or business opportunities. They were human beings with dreams, fears, and people who loved them. Heinrich Mueller stole their lives and served their flesh to families who trusted him to provide honest, quality food. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their case methodically. Heinrich's journals, victim identification through DNA evidence, testimony from Hans Weber about their victim selection process, and statements from community members who had unknowingly consumed human flesh for decades. When this trial concludes, Walsh told the jury, you will have heard evidence of crimes that challenge our basic understanding of evil. Heinrich Mueller spent 20 years proving that monsters can hide behind friendly smiles and community service while feeding us the flesh of our most vulnerable neighbors. Defense attorney Hayes approached the jury for his opening statement, faced with the impossible task of defending someone who had meticulously documented 47 murders in his own handwriting. Ladies and gentlemen, no one disputes that Heinrich Mueller killed these people. What you must decide is whether he possessed the mental capacity to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. The evidence will show that Heinrich suffers from severe psychological disorders developed during childhood trauma in war-torn Germany. Hayes argued that Heinrich's ability to maintain social relationships while systematically murdering people proved his complete detachment from reality. Heinrich genuinely believed he was providing a community service. In his mind, he was solving social problems while nourishing family. This delusion protected him from understanding the horror of his actions. The opening statements established the battle lines for a trial that would test the limits of the criminal justice system. The prosecution would prove Heinrich's systematic methodology and complete awareness of his crimes. The defense would argue that his very ability to function normally while committing such horrors proved his insanity. Heinrich himself remained an enigma, sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, occasionally nodding as if approving of how his case was being presented. His calm demeanor in the face of such accusations was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire proceeding. The trial would not just determine Heinrich Müller's fate, but force a community and a nation to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, vulnerability, and how evil can masquerade as respectability for decades without detection. After 6 weeks of testimony that had horrified the nation, the jury deliberated for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes before reaching their verdict. Court clerk Janet Morrison called the packed courtroom to order as the 12 jurors filed back into their seats, their faces bearing the weight of what they had heard and decided. Judge Patricia Martinez surveyed the courtroom one final time. Victim family members clutched photographs of their lost loved ones. Community members who had unknowingly consumed human flesh sat with haunted expressions, and news crews prepared to broadcast the conclusion of America's most disturbing criminal case. As the jury reached a verdict, Judge Martinez asked, Jury foreman David Walsh, a retired teacher who had struggled visibly throughout the trial, stood with the verdict forms in his trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor." Heinrich Mueller rose, his attorney, his expression as calm and attentive as it had been throughout the proceedings. Even facing potential execution, he maintained the composure that had allowed him to hide his crimes for 20 years. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Timothy Rodriguez, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. The words seemed to echo through the silent courtroom. Judge Martinez continued through all 47 murder charges, and 47 times the jury foreman delivered the same verdict. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Heinrich's face never changed expression, as his life was systematically dismantled through legal procedure. He had confessed to these crimes months ago, had documented them proudly in his journals, had shown investigators exactly how he committed them. The verdict was a formality, but hearing it pronounced 47 times gave weight to each individual life he had stolen. On the additional charges of kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, operating a criminal enterprise, and fraud, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Margaret Thompson wept silently in the gallery, remembering the 20 years she had praised Heinrich's products, the countless family dinners she had prepared, using human flesh, while believing she was serving the finest pork available. Her guilt was irrational but overwhelming. Hans Weber sat in shackles at a separate defendant's table, having pled guilty to 47 counts of accessory to murder in exchange for life imprisonment. His testimony against Heinrich had been devastating, describing in detail their victim selection process and the systematic way they had turned community compassion into a hunting ground. Judge Martinez called for victim impact statements before sentence. One by one, family members approached the podium to speak about their lost loved ones and the additional horror of learning how they had died. Maria Santos, sister of victim Carlos Santos, spoke through tears. "My brother was trying to get clean, trying to rebuild his life. He trusted the people who promised to help him, never knowing they were planning to murder him and feed him to families who thought they were eating pork. Heinrich Mueller didn't just kill my brother, he desecrated his memory by turning him into a product for sale." Robert Chan's daughter, Lisa, had traveled from California to attend the trial. "My father served his country in Vietnam, came home with wounds that never healed, and ended up on the streets through no fault of his own. He deserved compassion and help,
not to be murdered and consumed by people who never knew his name. 17 family members spoke, each describing not just the loss of their loved ones, but the additional trauma of learning they had been processed and sold as food. The impact statements took over 3 hours, but Judge Martinez allowed each family to speak for as long as they needed. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Martinez addressed Heinrich directly. "Mueller, you have been convicted of 47 counts of fifth-degree murder, along with numerous other felonies. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say?" Heinrich rose slowly, consulting notes he had prepared during the trial. His attorney had advised him to express remorse, to show some acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, but Heinrich had his own message to deliver. "Your Honor, I want the families to know that their loved ones were treated with the utmost respect and skill. I maintained the highest standards in all outs of my work, from procurement through processing to final presentation. My customers consistently praised the quality of my products." A gasp went through the courtroom as Heinrich continued his bizarre statement. "I served this community faithfully for 20 years. I brought families together around dinner tables, contributed to celebrations and holidays, supported local charities through my success. The fact that some of my protein sources were unconventional doesn't diminish the value I provided to hundreds of satisfied customers." Judge Martinez stared at Heinrich in disbelief. Even facing multiple death sentences, he showed no remorse, no acknowledgement that murder and cannibalism were morally wrong. His statement sounded like a business review rather than a criminal defendant's final word.
"Mr. Mueller," Judge Martinez said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "you have shown no remorse for your crimes, no recognition of the suffering you've caused, and no understanding of the evil you've perpetrated against this community and these families." She lifted the sentencing documents. "I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection on all 47 counts of first-degree murder. These sentences shall run consecutively, ensuring that even if any single conviction is overturned, you will remain on death row for the remainder of your natural life." Heinrich received the death sentence with the same calm acceptance he had shown throughout the trial. As bailiffs led him away in shackles, he nodded politely to the gallery as if concluding a successful business meeting. Hans Weber received 47 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. His cooperation had saved him from execution, but ensured he would die in prison for his role in identifying and delivering victims to Heinrich's basement chamber of horrors. As the courtroom emptied, Willowbrook began the long process of healing from 20 years of unwitting participation in systematic cannibalism, while families across multiple states faced the knowledge that their missing loved ones had been murdered and served as dinner to strangers who never knew their names. The demolition crew arrived in Willowbrook on a grey February morning, 6 months after Heinrich Mueller's conviction. The town council had voted unanimously to tear down the building that had housed his butcher shop, unable to bear the sight of the structure where 47 people had been processed and sold as food to their neighbors. Margaret Thompson stood across the street, watching as the wrecking ball swung toward the building where she had shopped faithfully for 20 years. Each impact sent debris flying, but couldn't demolish the memories of family dinners prepared with human flesh, of praising Heinrich's superior products to friends and neighbors. "It feels like we're trying to destroy evidence of our own shame," she said to her neighbor Janet Foster. "But tearing down that building won't change what we did, what we ate, what we fed our families." The psychological support center established in the former community center had seen over 400 residents since opening 3 months earlier. Sarah Williams, a trauma specialist brought in from the State University, had never encountered anything like the collective guilt and horror experienced by Willowbrook's population. Traditional therapy models don't address communities that have unknowingly participated in cannibalism for decades, Dr. Williams explained to the town council. These people feel complicit in crimes they never knew they were committing. They're grieving not just for the victims, but for their own lost innocence. The economic impact on Willowbrook had been devastating. Property values had collapsed as national attention turned the town into a symbol of awe. rather than small-town virtue. Local businesses closed as tourism evaporated, and residents moved away to escape the stigma of living in the cannibal town. Mayor Patricia Webb had submitted her resignation after the trial, unable to cope with the guilt of having personally thanked Heinrich for his contributions to community events. The new mayor, Tom Bradley, faced the impossible task of rebuilding not just the town's economy but its fundamental sense of identity. "We're not the first community to be betrayed by someone we trusted," Bradley told the remaining residents at a monthly town meeting. "But we may be the first to discover that betrayal took the form of systematic cannibalism disguised as quality customer service." The memorial committee had struggled for months to design an appropriate tribute to Heinrich's victims. How do you honor people who were not just murdered, but consumed by the community that should have protected them? The final design featured a simple granite monument inscribed with the names of all 47 identified victims and the words, "They were not forgotten. They were not forsaken. They were our neighbors, and we failed them." Pastor Williams had left Willowbrook after the trial, unable to reconcile his faith with the knowledge that he had blessed meals containing human flesh at countless church functions. The new pastor, Reverend Michael Torres, came from a ministry that specialized in helping communities recover from collective trauma. "Forgiveness starts with acknowledging the full scope of our complicity," Reverend Torres preached to congregations that had dwindled to a fraction of their pre-trial size. "We were victims of Heinrich's deception, but we were also participants in a system that made his crimes possible by ignoring the vulnerable people in our midst." The legal ramifications extended far beyond Heinrich's conviction. Dozens of civil lawsuits had been filed by victim families against the town, the county, and anyone who had profited from Heinrich's business. Insurance companies argued they weren't liable for claims related to systematic cannibalism, creating legal precedents that would take years to resolve. Dr. Elizabeth Morris had left her medical practice, haunted by her failure to recognize any signs of Heinrich's crimes, despite treating community members for 20 years. Her replacement, Amanda Chen, established new protocols for monitoring the health effects of long-term consumption of human flesh. Though medical literature provided little guidance, the physical health impacts appear minimal for people who consumed properly cooked human meat, Chen reported to health officials. The psychological impacts, however, may last for generations. We're seeing increased rates of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and post-traumatic stress throughout the community. The children of Willowbrook faced unique challenges. Teenagers who had grown up eating Heinrich's products struggled with their identity and self-worth. Support groups helped them process the knowledge that their physical development had been sustained, in part, by human flesh. Sarah Martinez's son, now 15, had stopped eating meat entirely after the trial. "How can I ever trust food again?" he asked his mother. "How can I trust anyone again? If Heinrich could fool everyone for 20 years, how do we know it's not happening somewhere else?" The question haunted not just Willowbrook, but communities across the country. The discovery of Heinrich's network had prompted investigations of butcher shops nationwide, though no additional operations were uncovered. Still, the knowledge that systematic cannibalism could hide behind quality service and community involvement had shattered Americans' faith in their local food suppliers. Real estate agents avoided showing properties in Willowbrook, knowing that potential buyers would research the town's history and discover its association with the most infamous cannibalism case in American history. The few families who remained faced the choice of living with permanent stigma or abandoning homes that had become unsellable. Some residents chose defiance rather than shame. They formed a committee dedicated to preserving the memory of Heinrich's victims while rebuilding their community's reputation. Their motto, printed on T-shirts and bumper stickers, read, "Willowbrook, we survived the unthinkable." The town's recovery would take decades, if it ever came at all. Heinrich Mueller had proven that evil could hide behind respectability and community service, feeding literally on the trust of neighbors while serving them the flesh of society's most vulnerable members. The scars left on Willowbrook served as a permanent reminder that monsters sometimes look exactly like the people we trust most. Documentary filmmaker Rachel Morrison pulled her rental car into what had once been the parking lot of Heinrich Müller's butcher shop. 20 years had passed since the trial that shocked the world, and Willowbrook looked like a town trying to forget its own history. A small memorial park occupied the space where Heinrich's shop once stood, with a simple granite monument bearing the names of his 47 identified victims. Rachel was here to film the final interviews for her documentary, The Butcher of Willowbrook, 20 years later. The project had taken 3 years to complete, as many survivors were still reluctant to discuss the case that had defined their community's identity for 2 decades. Margaret Thompson, now 85 and living in the assisted care facility on the outskirts of town, had finally agreed to be interviewed. She sat in the facility's sunroom, her hand still steady despite her age, though her eyes carried the weight of 20 years spent processing her unwitting participation in Heinrich's crimes. "People ask me if I've forgiven myself," Margaret said, her voice soft but clear. "That's the wrong question. The question is whether Timothy Rodriguez's family can forgive me for saying their son was the most tender pork I'd ever tasted. Whether Jennifer Walsh's mother can forgive me for recommending Heinrich's shop to other parents." Rachel had spent months researching the long-term impact of Heinrich's crimes on the survivors. Many of the families who had unknowingly consumed human flesh had moved away from Willowbrook within 5 years of the trial, unable to live with the memories and stigma. Others, like Margaret, had chosen to stay and bear witness to what happened in their community. "The hardest part wasn't learning what we'd eaten," Margaret continued. "It was learning how completely we'd been fooled. Heinrich made us complicit in his crimes through our trust, our gratitude, our praise for his work. He turned our basic human need for nourishment into participation in systematic murder." Tom Bradley had served as mayor for 15 years following the crisis, dedicating his tenure to rebuilding Willowbrook's economy and reputation. He met Rachel at the town hall, surrounded by photographs documenting the community's slow recovery. "We've had to learn to live with being known as the cannibal town," Bradley explained. "Young people leave for college and never come back. Businesses relocate to avoid the association. But the families who stayed have built something stronger than what we had before." The population of Willowbrook had stabilized at around 3,200 residents, down from the 5,800 who lived there during Heinrich's operation. The remaining community had developed a fierce loyalty to each other, bonded by shared trauma and the determination to prove that evil hadn't won. Heinrich Mueller had died on death row in 2018, 15 years after his conviction. He never expressed remorse for his crimes, spending his final years writing what he called his professional memoirs, detailed instructions for others who might want to follow his business model. Prison officials had confiscated and destroyed the manuscript. Hans Weber remained imprisoned, now 74 years old and still serving his consecutive life sentences. Occasionally, journalists would request interviews with him, seeking insight into how he had convinced himself that identifying victims for systematic cannibalism was charitable work. Rachel's documentary would be the theat's comprehensive examination of the case since the immediate aftermath of the trial. She'd interviewed FBI agents, victim family members, community survivors, and academic experts who had studied Heinrich's operation as an example of how systematic evil could hide behind respectability. Amanda Foster, now retired from the FBI, had spent 20 years analyzing Heinrich's psychological profile for law enforcement training programs. "Heinrich Mueller remains unique in criminal psychology," she told Rachel during their interview. "He created a sustainable business model based on systematic cannibalism while maintaining perfect community integration." We still use his case to train agents in recognizing organized psychopathy. The documentary would premiere at the Sundance Film Festival before airing on streaming platforms worldwide. Rachel knew it would bring unwanted attention back to Willowbrook, but she believed the story needed to be told completely and accurately, not sensationalized for entertainment value. Pastor Torres, now in his 20th year serving Willowbrook's churches, had watched multiple generations process the legacy of Heinrich's crimes. Children born after the trial still grew up knowing their town's history, inheriting trauma from events they never experienced directly. "We've learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting," Pastor Torres told Rachel. "It means bearing witness to evil while refusing to let it define us." Heinrich Mueller tried to corrupt the most basic human act, sharing a meal, but this community has reclaimed that ritual through conscious choice rather than innocent trust. The memorial park where Rachel conducted her final interview had become a pilgrimage site for people studying criminal psychology, community trauma, and the resilience of human nature. Visitors left flowers for Heinrich's victims while reading the stories of a community that survived the unthinkable. As Rachel packed her equipment, she reflected on the lesson Willowbrook offered the world. Heinrich Mueller had proven that monsters could hide behind quality service and community involvement, but his victims had also proven that communities could survive systematic betrayal and rebuild themselves around conscious compassion rather than naive trust. The documentary would tell both stories: how easily evil can disguise itself as virtue, and how powerfully human beings can heal from even the most unthinkable trauma when they face it together with honesty and determination. Willowbrook would always be known as the town where a trusted butcher fed human flesh to his neighbors for 20 years. But it would also be remembered as the community that survived, healed, and built something stronger from the ashes of that betrayal. FBI Academy instructor, Agent Sarah Martinez, stood before a classroom of new recruits at Quantico, holding up a photograph of Heinrich Mueller in his butcher's apron, smiling warmly at the camera during a 1995 community barbecue. The image had become one of the most studied photographs in criminal psychology courses across the country. This man fed human flesh to over 800 people for 20 years, while maintaining perfect social integration in his community. Agent Martinez told the assembled trainees he donated to charities, helped elderly customers carry their groceries, and was praised by local leaders as a model citizen. What does this tell us about our assumptions regarding criminal behavior? The Heinrich Mueller case had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached missing persons investigations, particularly those involving transient and homeless population. What had once been dismissed as voluntary disappearances were now scrutinized for patterns that might indicate systematic predation. Dr. Amanda Foster's comprehensive study of the Willowbrook case had become required reading in criminology programs worldwide. Her analysis identified 17 warning signs that should have alerted authorities to Heinrich's operation, from inconsistent supplier documentation to the suspicious loyalty of customers who praised his products with unusual enthusiasm. The most important lesson from the Mueller case, Dr. Foster had written, is that organized psychopaths don't operate in isolation. They require community complicity, though that complicity may be unknowing. Heinrich succeeded because he understood that people want to trust their neighbors, especially those who provide essential services. Congressional hearings following Heinrich's conviction had resulted in the Vulnerable Persons Protection Act, legislation requiring enhanced documentation for businesses serving high-risk populations. Homeless shelters, food banks, and social service organizations now maintain detailed records of client interactions and staff activities. The act also established federal funding for missing persons investigations involving transient individuals, addressing the systematic neglect that had allowed Heinrich and his network to operate undetected. Detective Mike Harrison, now retired, served as a consultant, helping departments across the country recognize patterns of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable populations. Heinrich taught us that missing homeless people aren't missing by choice, Detective Harrison explained to police academies. Someone who disappears from the streets may have been specifically targeted because their absence won't generate immediate investigative attention. We can't assume these disappearances are voluntary anymore. The food safety implications of Heinrich's crimes had prompted the most comprehensive overhaul of health inspection protocols since the establishment of the FDA. The Mueller standards, as they became known, required inspectors to verify the sources of all meat products through documented supply chains and surprise audit. Health Inspector Sarah Chen, whose routine inspection had uncovered Heinrich's operation, had become a national advocate for enhanced food safety measures. She'd testified before Congress about the ease with which Heinrich had maintained his operation while passing regular health inspection. Heinrich's basement facility was more sophisticated and sanitary than many legitimate meat processing plants, Chen explained to legislative committees. The issue wasn't cleanliness or food safety protocols. The issue was that we never verified where his products actually came from. Academic institutions had established the Mueller Institute for Community Safety Studies, dedicated to research on how criminal enterprises exceed social trust and community vulnerability. The Institute's work extended beyond serial killing to examine financial fraud, political corruption, and other crimes that require sustained community deception. Professor Janet Morrison, who directed the Institute's research programs, had identified what she termed Heinrich patterns, behavioral indicators suggesting that trusted community figures might be exploiting their positions for criminal purposes. Heinrich succeeded because he gave people exactly what they wanted: high-quality products, friendly service, and community involvement. Professor Morrison explained, he understood that exceeding expectations creates protective loyalty that shields criminals from scrutiny. The psychological impact of the Mueller case had influenced therapeutic approaches to collective trauma. Mental health professionals working with communities affected by systematic betrayal, from financial scams to institutional abuse, now used Willowbrook as a model for understanding how groups process complicity in crimes they didn't know they were committing. The international law enforcement community had incorporated Heinrich's methods into training programs for identifying human trafficking and organized crime networks. His systematic approach to victim selection and disposal had provided insights into how criminal enterprises operate within legitimate business structures. Interpol had distributed Heinrich's case files to member nations as part of their guidance on recognizing systematic crimes disguised as legitimate business operations. Several countries had discovered similar schemes following investigations prompted by the Willowbrook revelation. The case had also influenced legislation regarding the death penalty in cases involving systematic crimes against vulnerable populations. Heinrich's complete lack of remorse and his attempts to legitimize cannibalism had provided prosecutors with precedents for seeking capital punishment in cases where traditional legal frameworks seemed inadequate. The educational impact of Heinrich's crimes extended to social work programs, where students learned to recognize the signs of systematic exploitation within charitable organizations. Heinz Werber's role in identifying victims through his homeless outreach work had highlighted how criminal enterprises could corrupt even well-intentioned social services. The Mueller case proves that evil can be methodical, patient, and socially successful, Agent Martinez concluded her lecture to FBI recruits. Heinrich Mueller spent 20 years demonstrating that monsters don't always look like monsters. They sometimes look exactly like the people we trust most to serve our communities with skill and compassion. The Heinrich Mueller training manual, compiled from his confiscated writings and FBI analysis, remained classified but served as a reference for understanding how systematic criminals operate within legitimate community structures. Law enforcement agencies worldwide consulted the manual when investigating cases involving trusted public figures accused of systematic crimes. The legacy of Willowbrook served as both warning and inspiration, a reminder of how easily trust could be weaponized by those who understood human nature, and evidence of how communities could survive even the most unthinkable betrayal when they chose healing over denial. The last customer receipt from Heinrich Mueller's butcher shop sits in an evidence locker at the FBI field office in Denver, a mundane piece of paper that represents the end of 20 years of systematic horror disguised as exemplary customer service.
The receipt, dated April 14, 2003, one day before Health Inspector Sarah Chen's fateful visit, shows a purchase of £2 of what Heinrich labeled premium pork shoulder, sold to Mrs. Eleanor Walsh for. Mrs. Walsh never learned what she had actually purchased that Tuesday afternoon. She died of natural causes in 2019, 16 years after Heinrich's conviction, having spent her final years believing she had unknowingly consumed human flesh during 2 decades of shopping at his establishment. The receipt serves as a symbol of innocence lost and trust betrayed on the most fundamental level imaginable. Heinrich Mueller's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the social contracts that bind communities together. For 20 years, a systematic killer operated not on society's margins, but at its very heart, serving human flesh to families who trusted him with their most intimate gatherings. He turned the basic human act of sharing meals into participation in cannibalism, proving that monsters can hide behind quality service, community involvement, and the simple reliability of being there when people need them. The residents of Willowbrook discovered that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Heinrich displayed no traditional markers of violent psychopathy. He didn't torture animals as a child, didn't collect disturbing imagery, didn't struggle with social relationships or employment stability. Instead, he built a successful business and integrated himself seamlessly into community life, while systematically murdering the most vulnerable members of society. His success depended on exploiting 2 fundamental weaknesses in human social organization: our tendency to trust those who serve us well, and our willingness to ignore the suffering of people we don't see as fully part of our community. Heinrich understood that homeless individuals, transients and social outcasts existed in a kind of moral blind spot, where their disappearances wouldn't generate the investigative attention given to more socially connected victims. The collaboration between Heinrich and Hans Weber reveals another disturbing truth about systematic evil. It often requires accomplices who convince themselves they're serving a greater good. Hans transformed his charitable work with homeless populations into a hunting ground, selecting victims while maintaining his identity as their advocate. His ability to compartmentalize these contradictory roles demonstrates how individuals can participate in atrocities while preserving their moral self-image. The community members who unknowingly consumed human flesh for decades carry a unique form of trauma. They bear no legal responsibility for Heinrich's crimes, yet they struggle with the knowledge that their trust enabled his operation to continue. Their praise for his products, their recommendations to friends and neighbors, their gratitude for his community contributions. All of these normal social interactions became unwitting endorsements of systematic cannibalism. Margaret Thompson's question haunts everyone connected to this case. How do you seek forgiveness for crimes you didn't know you were committing? The families who fed Heinrich's products to their children, the community leaders who praised his contributions to local charities, the customers who celebrated special occasions with meals centered around human flesh, none of them chose to participate in cannibalism, yet all of them did. Heinrich's network of cannibalistic butchers across multiple states proves that his methods could be replicated and scaled. His correspondence with other operators reveals a systematic approach to identifying market opportunities, establishing supply chains, and maintaining customer satisfaction through systematic murder. The business-like approach to human consumption represents a new category of organized crime that law enforcement agencies are still learning to recognize and combat. The case raises fundamental questions about vigilance versus paranoia in modern communities. Heinrich succeeded because people trusted their neighbors and didn't question the sources of products that satisfied them. But his crimes shouldn't lead us to abandon trust entirely or view every service provider with suspicion. The challenge is developing better systems for protecting vulnerable populations without destroying the social bonds that make communities possible. Willowbrook's recovery demonstrates the resilience of human nature when confronted with unthinkable betrayal. Rather than dissolving under the weight of collective trauma, the community chose to rebuild itself around conscious compassion rather than naive trust. They transformed their experience from pure victimization into a warning that has protected countless other communities from similar exploitation. Heinrich Mueller's legacy serves as a permanent reminder that evil can be patient, methodical, and socially successful. It can hide behind helpful smiles and quality service, while feeding literally on the trust of those it betrayed. His 20-year operation proves that monsters sometimes look exactly like the neighbors we depend on most. The people who provide essential services with apparent skill and genuine concern for our well-being. The receipt in that evidence locker represents more than the end of Heinrich's operation. It symbolizes the moment when a community's comfortable assumptions about safety and trust were shattered forever. It reminds us that vigilance must be balanced with compassion, that protecting the vulnerable requires acknowledging their existence, and that evil often succeeds not through force, but through the exploitation of our better angel. Heinrich Mueller fed an entire community human flesh for 20 years, because people wanted to trust him, and he understood exactly how to earn and maintain that trust, while committing the most heinous crimes imaginable. His story serves as both warning and challenge. How do we protect ourselves from such predators without losing the capacity for trust that makes communities possible in the first place?